Story 1. Immigrating, they know they will probably never see their family back home again. Story 2. My great-grandfather homesteaded our farm in 1905. He spent his first few winters in rural Saskatchewan living in a sod house made from prairie grass. Temperatures can reach -40 degrees in Saskatchewan. He was 17 years old. Somehow he survived. It happened about 100 yards from where I am now. I live in his wooden house and still farm. Story 3. Survive in -50 degrees Fahrenheit Arctic conditions with nothing but animal skins and walls of snow carved from the ice. Story 4. Drag all their household laundry into the yard or a nearby creek to suds, boil, scrub and wring. Hang it on the line and bring it back inside. I would go mad in that cycle. Story 5. Forget ancestors. 30 years ago, entire families used to just show up at your door to hang out. No calls, no schedules, just, oh, we were driving through and thought we should stop by. Madness. Story 6. It's not one thing. It's the collective loss of history. I have a 1938 tractor that my grandfather could start within seconds. It still takes me minutes to find the right valve to open, as there are many, and then to use the choke. It is a manual, a technology many people are losing. Consider how the pyramids were built. People accomplished so much without computers or simulations. Story 7. I know the word ancestors conjures up images of people who lived more than 500 years ago, but it still blows my mind that a man walked on the moon 30 years after the Great Depression. Story 8. Moving to a new country to start a new life without knowing the local language, then learning it within months. Story 9. Baking bread for the very first time. The ingredients do not look anything like the final product. Story 10. Persistence hunting. You run after a deer until it is exhausted or overheated, then you jog up and kill it. Fucking deer. We used to be in better shape than a deer. Holy shit. Story 11. People performed successful skull and brain surgery a couple of thousand years ago, as far as we can tell. Story 12. Weaving. Do you know how fucking complicated a loom is? How the hell did somebody dream that up? Story 13. They navigated the Pacific Ocean in canoes until they reached land. Story 14. Every time I see architecture like St. Paul's Cathedral or the Vatican, I wonder how they managed to build such huge, ornate marble buildings without power tools, modern materials, scaffolding, or even adequate lighting. I cannot understand the Vatican being built at a time when there was a Roman racetrack and a public square. Consider the level of technology they had. Story 15. Sometimes I sit awake at night and wonder how humanity figured out mushrooms. Did people think, okay, this one tastes meat-like, that one killed Bill, and another made me see Jesus for 3 weeks? Story 16. This is definitely specific to the United States and refers to westward expansion. It was astonishing that people went west with no knowledge of what lay ahead, crossing major rivers such as the Missouri and the Mississippi. Story 17. Possibly as far back as 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, Central Asian sheep and goat herders developed a distinct type of dog to protect their flocks without any knowledge of deoxyribonucleic acid, and with only a basic understanding of heredity. Story 18. The ways they discovered agriculture, smelted metals, built giant civilizations, mapped the known world, and domesticated animals blow my mind. Story 19. My great-grandmother raised my grandmother alone in a small remote town in Italy for 15 years while my great-grandfather was in America. He left while she was still pregnant, was not even around for the birth, and did not see them again for 15 years. Story 20. Having an injury that you just have to live with because who is going to fix it? Toothache, broken bones, torn ligaments, vision loss, etc. The list of common bodily inconveniences is endless. For us, it may be a quick fix or a prolonged recovery after treatment, but for them it can mean death or a lifetime of suffering. Story 21. Have a screaming baby and avoid being eaten by every passing predator. Babies are loud and have no way to be turned off. Story 22. My great-grandmother left an abusive marriage in 1920 and raised my grandmother and her 2 sisters by herself. It was unheard of at the time. Story 23. remembering thousands of lines from before written language. This is not a joke about having the Holy Grail memorized line by line. In a few cases people do that, but more often it is the retention of what amounts to small libraries of knowledge. Story 24. They fought against their enslavement in the Caribbean, created maroon towns, and led major bloody uprisings against the colonial powers. Although the United Kingdom highlights its role in abolishing slavery, my ancestors fought, many sacrificing their lives, to make it as difficult as possible for slavery to continue. They would probably be labeled terrorists today. Story 25. Just walking everywhere across entire continents. I mean, come on. Story 26. Roman aqueducts. I have had them explained to me many times. I understand the basics, but I still do not fully get it. The idea that someone thought, hey, I need this water to go back up a hill, so I am just going to do it, is kind of amazing. Story 27. Pottage was a vegetable soup or stew kept on the fire continuously. People would add to it as they ate. It was boiled into a thick, glutinous paste. It often had to be cooked that long because the vegetables were grown using human excrement. Peasants ate this way for centuries. Story 28. I discovered that oysters are tasty. These Titipool rocks are actually alive. Take one, crack it open, and eat the slimy interior. Story 29. My great-great-great-grandmother and her daughter were suffragettes. Several of them were imprisoned for our right to vote. They came from a very comfortable background but felt passionately about the cause and risked death. Story 30. Travel and trade. I am still amazed at how far people traveled in the past. It is easy to forget that people did not just stay home. They traveled, observed, brought things back, and accomplished much more. Trade routes were vast and highly complex. It is humbling to look back at earlier cultures and see how much they accomplished. Story 31. She was not just an ancestor. She was my grandmother, and I had a wonderful relationship with her. When she was a teenager, she had to be hidden in an attic to avoid being taken to a concentration camp like her sister. We never found out what happened to her sister. I cannot imagine living in that world. It always puts into perspective how recent World War II was. Story 32. Get in a wagon with your husband and kids and travel for months across unknown territory to establish a homestead. As a woman today, I would say no way. Story 33. It is conjectured that prehistoric hunter-gatherers, when they killed a large herbivore, ate not only fatty parts such as the brain but also the animal's partially digested stomach contents. Cavemen pulled plant material from deer stomachs, cooked it, and ate it. Story 34. Their descendants have survived to the present day despite the many downright insane rulers and beliefs that could have wiped them out. Story 35. They kept their sanity and hope while people around them died young in inexplicable ways. Many endured chronic pain and illness without any means of relief. Aspirin was invented relatively recently. Story 36. One example from classical history is Hannibal's campaign against the Romans during the Second Punic War. It is astonishing. After his father drowned in battle and his brother-in-law was murdered, Hannibal took command of an army during one of the most contentious and violent periods in history. He was 26 years old. I could barely manage a checking account at that age, and he was leading an army surrounded by enemies. Celts, Gauls, Spanish tribes, and the Romans at Saguntum. He defeated them all and unified southern Spain. He then marched his army through Spain and Gaul into the Alps, facing existential threats at every turn. Hostile tribes tried to block him. He outwitted them and pressed on. Roman forces pursued him. He evaded them. Gauls ambushed him. He repelled the ambush. He arrived in northern Italy with an exhausted force of about 20,000 soldiers and proceeded to win remarkable victories against Roman armies that consistently outnumbered him, had better armor and supplies, and were fighting on their own turf. Cannae is his magnum opus, but his other victories were equally extraordinary. He operated with near impunity in Italy for almost 20 years without suffering defeat, and had to leave only because of the failures of other Carthaginians. The mentality of such a person is beyond my comprehension. Story 37. Having families with 10 or more children and somehow feeding them all. Story 38. The very first person to tame a horse must have been a sight to see. They must have looked like a god to the others in the group the first time they rode such a glorious animal, not only managing to stay on but actually being in control. That must have been awesome. Story 39. People invented thread, string, rope, and other cordage, then used them for countless purposes. They wove fabric and textiles to keep bodies warm and protected, bound spear points with birch bark tar, made bows for hunting, and crafted bags for carrying goods. They also made sails and rigging that allowed sea travel. In many ways, string and thread are among the most basic and fundamental human inventions. Many other inventions would not have been possible without them. Story 40. Brewerina fish traps are among the oldest man-made structures on the planet. As an Aboriginal Australian, I am proud. I am surprised they have not been destroyed for mining. Story 41. Work 12-hour days, 6 days a week, drink and smoke, live to be 80 years old. Story 42. To quote a song by The Streets, for billions of years since the outset of time, every one of your ancestors on your mom and dad's side survived, successfully looked after, and passed on new life. Story 43. Everything they did was extraordinary, which is why humanity survived. From the discovery of fire, the wheel, and language to paper, printing, metallurgy, and the internet, these innovations made our survival possible. Story 44. My parents immigrated from the Soviet Union to the United States. Truly blows my mind. They arrived with absolutely nothing and no money. Driving home from an interview the other day, I was overwhelmed with gratitude for my parents and for having immigrated here so I could have a better life. I started crying. Story 45. Settling in an unfamiliar country, building communities, and creating the infrastructure we enjoy today. Story 46. People wore wool and wigs in the summer in the mid-Atlantic and southern states. My God, the humidity. Story 47. Australia fascinates me. It is the only continent that did not independently invent the bow and arrow, not because its people were not clever, but because there were few trees suitable for making a bow. The wood is too dense and inflexible, so a bow would shatter if drawn. Instead, they invented the woomera, a type of otlotl that could propel a spear with tremendous force, capable of striking a very large animal. They understood how to use leverage and created a terrifying weapon. Story 48. It is astonishing that anyone survived, not just humankind but all ancestors right back to the beginning of life on Earth. There were many mass extinctions and widespread famine and disease. Story 49. A few years ago, our dentist discovered that my son had a floating tooth in the roof of his mouth. It was removed by an oral surgeon. I asked whether removal was necessary since it was not bothering him. Apparently, such teeth can migrate through the face and cause pain and infections in the nasal cavity. Ancient cultures around the world believed people became possessed by demons or wandering souls when a mysterious tooth or teeth suddenly fell from the nose of someone who had been complaining of headaches and facial pain. We had it removed to spare him future embarrassment should the extra tooth be expelled when he sneezed. In some cultures, a person thought to be possessed was even sacrificed. Story 50. What blows my mind is that people today advocate a flat Earth hypothesis, even though humans recognized the world as a globe more than 2,300 years ago. That was so long ago, yet people still have it wrong. Story 51. There was a time when people left their houses without carrying a telephone. It was absolutely amazing. Story 52. For most of human history and in most places, homes had only one room. An entire multi-generational family lived together with no privacy. If you needed to do something we consider private, such as changing clothes, managing your menstrual period, or having sex, you were probably doing it in the same room as your parents and your children. Story 53. My grandmother survived the Great Depression and raised 6 gifted children. She fought the school board to establish a gifted program in her school district, then built the classroom herself in skirts using her own tools. She worked as the teacher's aide, helping all 6 of her children and hundreds of other gifted students in Chicago reach graduation. She marched for women's right to vote. Joyce is a badass. Story 54. They gave their lives to bring about social change. Suffragettes starved themselves to death in protest of women being denied the vote. Martin Luther King Jr., was assassinated for working to achieve equal rights for African Americans. Story 55. Biphasic sleep. People would go to bed and sleep for a few hours. Everyone in the house woke up around midnight, spent time together, then went back to sleep until morning. This was the norm for most of human history and changed only with the discovery of electricity and the invention of the light bulb. Story 56. How long it took humans to understand infections is surprising. The technology to see germs, bacteria, and so on was not available for a long time, but people understood long before recorded history that an open wound could become life-threatening. It is odd that no one made the logical leap earlier. 150 years ago, some surgeons considered washing their hands before operating unnecessary, even though the benefits could have been verified and earlier patient survival rates improved when hands were washed. You do not need to see microscopic organisms or understand exactly how they work to test the hypothesis that clean hands improve surgical outcomes. Story 57. Do you know how fucked I'd be trying to get dinner on the table at night if I had to hunt, kill, skin, portion, and cook it over a fucking fire? My family would only eat every other day. Story 58. I am thinking about how people living thousands of years ago were much like us. Their cultures were different, but they were just as intelligent. They achieved incredible things with the resources and knowledge they had. It is astonishing once you study and understand these people not as historical footnotes but as living, breathing humans who left their marks on the world. Take the Roman Empire, for instance. They were masters of architecture, civil engineering, art, and warfare. They built roads and aqueducts that have lasted for centuries. People lived, loved, and died as we do. Even the mightiest empires eventually collapse or transform. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. One day our current civilization will also be history. It makes me think about future archaeologists. What will they make of our civilization? What will our legacy be? Story 59. People, including children, drank beer because it helped purify water and make it drinkable. They preserved meat by layering it with salt in wooden barrels. You learn a lot when researching life on the Mayflower. Story 60. Honestly, everything. The fact that humanity not only survived but thrived to the extent that I am sitting here typing this is beautiful. Story 61. They were people like you and me, living in the forest without the benefits of society and relying on whatever their tribe could work out together. Story 62. Church. Not only did these people live the hardest lives possible, they also went to church, built churches, and created societies within the church. Missionaries, ladies' aid, youth departments, lay organizations, stewards, trustees, Sunday schools, and choirs. They cooked meals and raised money for the church, for scholarships, for the poor, and for the community. After working a full-time job, all I want to do is go home and watch Netflix. These people created a second part-time volunteer job called church. It's exhausting just to think about. Story 63. Humans selectively bred a wolf into a Pekingese within a few thousand years. I do not understand it and never will. Story 64. We survive. We are weak meat sacks. How we have lasted this long, I will never know. Story 65. It is amazing that we realized that seeds make plants grow. It was probably discovered in a similar way. Unga. What is brother doing? Bunga. Brother is putting the grain in the dirt. Unga. Why is brother Chuna doing this? He is wasting our food. Bunga. Chuna believes that small grains will make more grain if buried and then watered. Unga. Chuna is a fool. 2 weeks later. Bunga. Unga. Come see what Chuna has done. Unga. Why is the grass in a straight line? Bunga. Big brother Chuna has made the grass from the grain. Unga. Impossible. For weeks later. Bunga. Brother Chuna says that we can harvest the wheat soon. Unga. I am still amazed that Chuna was right. Chuna is strange but smart. Bunga. I have a theory that I can grind the grain and mix it with water and fire to make food. Unga. I may believe that Chuna makes grass, but you cannot make such a thing. Bunga invents bread soon afterward. Story 66. I am still trying to figure out how my grandfather walked uphill through 18 inches of snow to get to school and 8 hours later, walked uphill again to get home. Story 67. There's a belief that a woman can predict pregnancy by urinating on a certain grain, and that it can also indicate the baby's sex. I do not know the details, but I have always wondered how our ancestors discovered this and where the practice originated. Story 68. He tested whether things were edible by trial and error. He ate an orange mushroom and died. Do not eat those. Story 69. They packed up and immigrated to a new country, not knowing exactly what they would find but leaving everything behind. Story 70. Map out astronomical wonders, concepts of calendars and time, and understand physics. It is all crazy to me. Story 71. The Antikythera mechanism suggests there must have been many more, and probably some that were even more intricate. Hopefully we will unearth more of them. Story 72. Sailing. People have traveled over water for thousands of years. There is no room for error on a boat. If it sinks, you lose all your belongings or worse. Story 73. Give birth. Ask any woman who has a child whether she or her child would have survived without modern medicine. It is astonishing how many confidently say no. My twins could have survived if someone had fed them, because I would have died in childbirth. Instead, I was absolutely fine 2 days later. Story 74. They had to endure losing children and still carry on. Imagine having 5 children and only 2 reach adulthood. Story 75. I can only imagine the rape and pillaging my ancient ancestors must have committed to pass the baton of life to me. Sitting here generations later, sipping coffee and browsing the internet, without having to brutalize others or merely survive, and instead being able to make a comfortable living. Story 76. Mine for gold, then slink back to a candlelit tent for years. Story 77. They grow or hunt all their own food, often in harsh conditions. Story 78. Some of my ancestors migrated from the United Kingdom to Australia on a 600-ton wooden sailing ship that took 4 months to complete the voyage. They spent those 4 months bouncing on the ocean in a leaky, rotten, rat-infested, cramped vessel, knowing they might not even survive the trip. By comparison, I make the same journey and complain about being stuck in a plane for 24 hours while being served hot food in air-conditioned comfort. I am flying with Queensland and Northern Territory aerial services, which essentially guarantees I will arrive safely. Story 79. The Polynesians and Pacific Islanders sailed the largest ocean in relatively small boats, navigated by the stars, and settled small islands that took the rest of the world hundreds of years and modern technology to reach successfully. Our ancestors' perseverance in hunting was extraordinary. They literally ran after prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, sometimes for dozens of miles. Their tracking ability was so precise that they could single out and isolate one animal from a herd to prevent it from resting. Story 80. When Napoleon took Moscow in 1812, his army marched the entire distance. I always knew this, but recently, while reading a book about him, the sheer effort was brought home to me. Story 81. My grandfather's religion was food. He grew 4 varieties of potatoes by himself. He knew each one's soil preference, when to plant, when to harvest, how to store them, and in what order to use them. We had edible potatoes as late as the following April. You want to know my knowledge of potatoes? Idaho. He knew these things about everything he grew. In addition, he and friends dip-netted thousands of catfish from the nearby river in the spring. The river is now so polluted and silted that few fish remain. The Great Depression created such people. Story 82. Whenever I drive over the Colorado mountain passes, I am amazed at and grateful to the engineers and construction crews who had the audacity to put a highway there. Story 83. Burned people at the stake and subjected them to other forms of torture. Story 84. Build incredibly large, heavy monuments and buildings by hand. Story 85. The Romans built roads that are still standing. Medieval builders constructed castles and cathedrals designed to last 1,000 years, and that skill has been lost. We cannot even build a road that lasts a year without repairs. Story 86. Invent things. I have a strong interest in firearms and in the person who made the first firearm. Hey, this black powder seems useless but makes a powerful explosion when confined. Wait, what if I put the powder in a tube with a ball in front of it and used it to launch the ball at someone? Story 87. Genetic selection and breeding of crops required many changes. The number of changes that occurred early on for wild rice to become cultivated rice and for wild wheat to become modern wheat is far greater than most people expect. Story 88. For me, it's surviving the Ice Age while there were 11-foot-tall bears that hunted people. I guess the slow ones didn't make it. Story 89. My great-great-grandfather worked in a coal mine from the age of 10 after his father died, and the family needed a breadwinner. When the headmaster discovered he was skipping school to work, he dragged him back until he completed his schooling at age 12. He then worked in that mine until his mid-70s, picking at the seam, and only retired because he broke his leg. Meanwhile, I complain about carrying heavy groceries home. Story 90. Astronomers used prisms to calculate distances to stars in the 1600s and 1700s. Story 91. Domesticating animals. The clearest proof of this is horses trained for polo. You are talking about prey animals that not only tolerate screaming riders on their backs who flail mallets, but also understand that their job is to chase the ball and that they enjoy it. Training predator behaviors into a prey animal is astonishing. Story 92. I don't have to look too far back. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors. My grandfather hid in a Polish family's attic. I have always wanted to find out who they were, but I never did. He snuck into Russia and joined the Red Army at 14. My grandmother, who may have suffered the most, always said, "When there's a will, there's a way." I have realized as an adult that it has become my mantra and informs how I live my life. Story 93. My grandmother had her first child at 17. She began dating my grandfather when she was 15 and he was 28. She had 7 children and cared for her bedridden in-laws. She worked as a lunchroom worker and also lived and worked on a dairy farm. This mostly occurred during the Great Depression in the United States, so they lived in extreme poverty. She had my father much later in the 1950s. She was a strong woman. Story 94. Build extremely sophisticated ships and navigate by the stars. Story 95. Survive on the Great Plains in teepees and furs. Weather in the Dakotas is notoriously brutal. Story 96. Someone stubbed their toe on an oyster while walking in the water. They picked it up and thought that if they cracked it open, they could eat what was inside. Story 97. They sailed from Polynesia to South America without knowing there would be land. Story 98. Carving what would become our country out of the wilderness during the colonial era involved wandering for weeks or months into the hazardous unknown, hacking trees down with axes, measuring land in 22-yard increments with very heavy chains, and recording measurements with limited accuracy on rough paper and quill pens. They then returned to town to encourage others to build on what they had measured and expand civilization. The primitiveness of it all amazes me, given our modern world of chainsaws and large motorized equipment. Story 99. My paternal grandfather came from a communist country. Thanks to Canadian immigration, he emigrated to the middle of the prairies. Once he had everything set for farming and living, 2 years later my baba and my father emigrated. My father was 9 and came in 1929. Somehow my grandfather and other peasants knew the times were horrid in Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, and got out. The Holodomor, a man-made famine in the early 1930s under Stalin, killed millions of Ukrainians, including many farmers and villagers. Story 100. They thought up the concept and created the ultrasound. What on earth is that? How does someone come up with something like that? Story 101. How did people clean their genitals and buttocks without comfortable toilet paper or water hoses? Story 102. Survived the 1906 earthquake that destroyed 80% of San Francisco and went right back to work. To be fair, there was a lot of work to be done after that. Story 103. How did they survive without refrigerators for food storage or toilets? Story 104. I have a lot of respect for the person who first rode and trained a horse. They looked at an animal 10 times the size of a human that could run at 30 miles per hour and thought, I am going to get on that and tell it what to do. The idea of being executed is also astonishing. To walk to the scaffold, kneel and place your head on the block, or allow them to put a rope around your neck is simply astonishing. Story 105. There were no calls, letters, or telegrams, and no way to contact anyone who lived farther than a day's journey. People traveled for months or years on foot or by animal, and their families did not know where they were. Was someone born? Did someone die? Families often learned about such events only much later. Story 106. They survived without electricity, modern heating, indoor plumbing, antibiotics, or modern medical care. Story 107. Performing amputations and surgeries without anesthesia or painkillers. Story 108. All of them, for thousands of years, managed to have sexual relations before they died. Story 109. My great-grandmother moved from Oslo to Vancouver Island, Canada, mostly alone. Her husband was a sailor and at sea when she left. She was pregnant and had a 3-year-old. A few years later, she had to leave abruptly. The story goes that she threw her father out of the house because he drank heavily and abused her mother. So, with an 8-year-old, a 5-year-old, and very pregnant, she left in the 1920s with just a train ticket to New York and no money for the ship home. She somehow arranged a meeting with the owner of a large Norwegian shipping company in New York, and he gave them free passage on one of his ships. Back in Oslo, she kicked out her father for good and moved in with her mother. She gave birth to my great-aunt 3 weeks after arriving in Oslo. My father has some of her letters both to home and to a friend in Canada from that time, and the ship tickets with a personal greeting and the price. Otherwise, it would be hard to believe. Story 110. I do not understand how farming sustains a family. How do you manage the timing of crops so there is always something to eat? It's hard to imagine. Story 111. I think it's the throwing of feces into the street and then being confused by the level of disease. Story 112. My grandparents and great-grandparents left school at the age of 12, and then all started working full-time. Story 113. Surviving always amazes me when I think about all the humans who came before me throughout various eras, each contributing to my existence. It is a continuous journey of making the right decisions, at least when it is about staying alive. Story 114. I found out during a history project on my family tree about an old dam that broke and flooded the area where my family grew up. Our ranch and farmland were one of only 4 or 5 that survived the flooding and were responsible for keeping people alive while the surrounding forest was destroyed. My family provided shelter, food, and other necessities. I believe it was my great-grandparents' land. I went to City Hall because there was supposed to be a marker commemorating the event. I saw pictures and heard stories from my grandparents, and City Hall had a record of the dam breaking and of a few farms that survived, but they never marked which ones. We tried for years to get the city to recognize the farmland and the other surviving farms, but they refused to acknowledge them. The land had been sold by the time I found out, although it was still a fairly successful farm. My father is the last surviving person who actually lived on the land, and while he wished his family name could be recognized, he has accepted that it will fade into history. I am more upset that the broken dam has several markers while the farms that survived, some of which are still active today, have none. Story 115. One of them was the very first human to look at a cow and think, milk. It is bold. Story 116. I just flew to Las Vegas. Looking out the window at the topography, the mountains, valleys, gullies, streams, and rivers, sometimes green, sometimes barren, sometimes snow-covered, made me appreciate the magnitude of westward travel. People navigated all of that in wagon trains. It is astonishing that anyone survived such a journey. Story 117. Survive. People today lose their minds when Popeyes runs out of chicken or the internet does not work for 5 minutes. Imagine if they had to actually fight for their food. Story 118. Ancient warfare must have been terrifying. Although the number of deaths in battles was lower than in modern times, most battles saw only a few hundred or a couple of thousand killed in the fighting, with many more later dying from infection. Story 119. My ancestor was sold into slavery, brought to the Americas, and worked at the first ironworks and wood mill. It is striking to think that, without those industries, colonization would not have been successful. Story 120. Once I had to walk to the auto parts store and back carrying front brake rotors and discs. It was about 2 miles each way. By the time I got home, my arms and hands were exhausted. That load is not very heavy compared with what people have accomplished using only their bodies over time. It puts in context what people who walk miles to fetch water and then carry it back endure. Consider the pyramids in Mesoamerica, built without beasts of burden, wheels, or, as far as I know, any complex machinery. They were built by people carrying stones. Story 121. Eating a bunch of random things and slowly figuring out which ones are food, not food but harmless, harmful, will kill you, or will kill you only after a long period of steady consumption like years or decades. Story 122. The basic everyday things I take for granted. Gathering enough water for washing, cooking, and drinking, and collecting wood for heating and cooking. Even lighting could be an ordeal, especially for the poor. People could make drip candles or rush lights, but even those required a lot of work. Most people had to grow or hunt their food and then process it to make it edible. That included skinning, gutting, and butchering animals, milling flour, churning butter, and making and sewing clothes. Some even made their own cloth. The amount of work required every day just to survive is astonishing. I have light and hot water at the flip of a switch or the turn of a knob. I can reach a grocery store in under 5 minutes and access more kinds of food than most of my ancestors would have seen in a lifetime. It is wild to think how laborious simple tasks were and how many different skills a single person had to master. Story 123. When I tell my kids what it was like being in sales in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they are blown away. No global positioning system, no World Wide Web, no cell phones. So much work before departure. After I arranged a meeting by phone and got the prospect to speak with me, I would then sheepishly call back the prospect's secretary and ask for directions from the airport and for landmarks to watch for on the way to the office. Many people had secretaries. If I needed to make a call on the road or if the car broke down, I had to hope to find a phone booth. I am female, and some trips involve driving in rural areas. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.